I'm Carly, 28, and I'm getting married in a few months. You'd think that would be a time of joy, right? But my family has managed to turn it into a twisted nightmare. See, I'm the older sister by 4 years, and my sister Erin is 24. Growing up, it was obvious who the favorite was, though it took me a while to realize how deep that ran. My parents put Erin on a pedestal, whether they meant to or not, and every big moment in my life, she somehow managed to steal the spotlight. It started small. When I was 7, my birthday was a quiet celebration at home with a simple homemade cake and a few family gifts. But Erin's 5th birthday? They threw her this elaborate party with a bouncy castle and a hired clown. It was the kind of party you see in movies, the kind every kid would dream of. And I stood there trying to be happy for her, but feeling like I was somehow less worthy of the attention. It wasn't just birthdays. In school, the favoritism only became more obvious. When Erin was in kindergarten, she got a part in the school play. My parents couldn't stop raving about it. They even invited our extended family to watch her 10-second big moment. A couple of years later, I was excited because I'd landed a solo in a school concert, something I'd worked hard for. My mom showed up briefly, sneaking in at the last minute and ducking out right after without saying a word. Dad didn't come at all, something about having to work late. As I sang, I tried to focus, ignoring the empty seats, but I couldn't help feeling forgotten. Christmas was a whole other level of favorites only. One year, Erin and I both had our hearts set on the same video game console. I'd hinted for weeks that it was all I wanted. But Christmas morning came, and there was the console, under the tree, with Erin's name on it. I tried not to look disappointed as I unwrapped a series of books they'd picked out for me. I did like to read, so it was thoughtful in a way, but it was clear who had gotten the real gift and who had gotten the consolation prize. I tried to keep a brave face, but that hollow feeling lingered. Over the years, Erin always seemed to get the best of everything. She had the newest clothes, the coolest gadgets, and far more freedom than I ever had. At 16, when I'd asked for a later curfew, my parents shot it down, giving me a lecture about responsibility. Erin, when she reached that age, was free to come and go as she pleased. Apparently, she'd earned their trust, and I was the fool for even asking. School was supposed to be my escape, a place where I could shine based on my own efforts. I did well in classes, made the honor roll, and tried to do things that would make my parents proud. But even there, I felt overlooked. When Erin had trouble in math, my parents hired tutors, sat with her every night, and praised her for every small improvement. When did I do well academically? It was expected. My achievements were met with a quick smile and a nod, and then the conversation would shift back to Erin's latest struggle, or her big win in something. It felt like everything I did was in her shadow. In 5th grade, I entered the school science fair, pouring weeks of effort into a motorized solar system model that I was so proud of. I painted the planets, wired the motors, and spent nights fine-tuning every detail. The night of the fair, I waited at my project display, eager to show it to my parents, sure this was something they'd be proud of. Halfway through the evening, they still hadn't shown up. When they finally walked in, they breezed over to me with a quick apology. They'd been at a parent-teacher conference for Erin. They gave my project a quick glance, told me it looked great, then spent the rest of the night talking about Erin's progress in her reading club. When my project won 2nd place, I put the ribbon on my bedroom wall, proud but feeling invisible all over again. In high school, I figured things would be different. I thought if I just worked hard enough, I'd stand out. So I threw myself into every opportunity, clubs, volunteering, even the student council. By sophomore year, I was elected vice president, a position I'd worked tirelessly to earn. I came home that day practically buzzing, ready to share the news with my parents. But when I walked into the kitchen, they were already celebrating. Erin had made the cheerleading squad. They'd bought her balloons, cake, and the whole 9 yards. My big achievement? Barely mentioned. At dinner, I tried to bring it up, but my mom brushed it aside, saying, "That's great, Carly," before launching back into a conversation about Erin's cheerleading schedule. I learned to keep my wins to myself after that. In the senior year, I started looking at colleges, aiming for a top school out of state where I could finally carve out my own path. I poured everything into my applications and was thrilled when the acceptance letters started rolling in. The day I got into my dream school, I came home ready to share it with my family. But the minute I walked through the door, I saw they were already celebrating again, this time for Aaron's acceptance to a local college. My news was met with mild approval and quickly overshadowed by talk of Aaron's plans to stay close to home. When I mentioned that I was excited to go out of state, they looked worried, not proud, saying things like, "Isn't it too far? Don't you want to stay closer to family?" So I left, taking my acceptance letter, my dreams, and whatever savings I had, and moved out. My parents acted confused, as if they didn't understand why I'd want to be on my own. Erin didn't even notice until she saw my empty room. I struggled, juggling classes, work, and rent. My tiny apartment was barely livable, but it was mine. Every night as I lay on my lumpy mattress, exhausted from a long day of classes and a late-night shift, I reminded myself why I'd left. For the first time, I wasn't just Erin's sister. I was Carly, and my hard work was for me alone. Over the years, I built a life for myself. It was tough, no doubt about it, but it felt real, like I was finally standing on my own 2 feet. And then I met Luke. We'd been friends since sophomore year of college, and over time, that friendship grew into something deeper. Luke was nothing like anyone I'd ever dated. He listened, he cared, and he valued me for who I was. He knew about my family's issues, the favoritism, the years of feeling invisible. He never judged, just understood and stood by me. When he proposed, it wasn't some grand gesture but a private moment that was perfectly us. We'd gone hiking, reached a beautiful lookout, and just as the sun was setting, he took my hand, pulled out a ring, and asked if I'd marry him. I said yes without a second thought. Sharing the news with my family was another story. Luke encouraged me to try, saying maybe this would be a way to heal old wounds. So I went home with him one weekend to make the announcement. Erin wasn't home when we arrived, but my parents were there, and for once they seemed genuinely happy for me. A small win, I thought. But then Erin came home, and things quickly soured. Even after I introduced Luke as my fiancé, she started flirting with him, right in front of me. She didn't care that I was there, didn't care that Luke and I were about to get married. My mom didn't say a word, just watched it happen like it was totally normal. Luke stayed calm, even holding me close to keep me from reacting. We made it through that awkward visit and left, but I could tell something was bothering him. A few days later, he pulled me aside and admitted that Erin had been messaging him on social media, telling him he should leave me, saying she'd be better for him. I was furious. How could she stoop so low? I'd put up with years of her stealing the spotlight, but this was different. This was my future, my happiness. I told Luke I'd handle it. The next day, I drove over to my parents' house, ready to confront Erin, and finally put my foot down. I went to my parents' house the next morning, determined to set things straight. I hadn't called ahead because I didn't want to give Erin or anyone else the chance to prepare some excuse. I needed the raw truth, and I needed them to hear me for once. As I pulled into the driveway, I steeled myself, my mind replaying all the things I wanted to say. My heart was pounding, but this was it. I wasn't going to let her walk all over my life this time. When I walked in, my mom was sitting at the kitchen table reading the newspaper, and Dad was in his usual spot with his morning coffee. "Hey, Carly, everything okay?" Mom asked, folding up the newspaper, already eyeing me with a look I knew too well. The look that said, "What now?" "Where's Erin?" I asked, skipping the pleasantries. "Oh, she's still asleep?" Mom replied, shrugging as if that were the most normal thing in the world. "You know how she is on weekends." I took a deep breath, deciding to start with them first. "I came over to talk about something serious, and I need you both to listen. It's about Erin and Luke." The moment I mentioned Luke's name, I saw their faces change. Dad looked confused, but Mom raised an eyebrow like she already knew where this was going. I didn't let her interrupt. Ever since I introduced Luke as my fiancé, Erin's been, let's just say, acting inappropriately. She's been flirting with him, messaging him, and even telling him he should leave me for her. I watched their reactions closely, hoping to see shock, disappointment, anything that showed they understood the severity of the situation. Instead, Mom just sighed, almost like she was expecting this. "Well, You know how close you two are in age, Carly. Erin's probably just feeling a little left out with you getting married first. Maybe she's just acting out. Acting out? I repeated, disbelief clear in my voice. Mom, she's been messaging my fiancé, telling him she's better for him than I am. How is that just acting out? Dad finally looked up, his face as blank as ever, and muttered, Maybe it's a misunderstanding, Carly. You know how Erin can be. No, Dad, this isn't a misunderstanding, I snapped, unable to hold back the frustration. She's been crossing boundaries for weeks and I'm sick of it. And I can't believe you're both standing there acting like this is some small sibling rivalry. She's actively trying to ruin my relationship. Mom looked away, clearly uncomfortable, and then took a deep breath, like she was gearing up for something. Carly, I was actually hoping we could talk about something as well, she started, her tone calm, but with that undertone I'd come to resent over the years. Well, Erin's told us she has feelings for Luke, real, genuine feelings. I felt my stomach drop, but I stayed silent, letting her finish. She's in love with him, Carly, Mom continued, her voice barely above a whisper. And we think maybe you should consider what that means. Erin has always been sensitive. Maybe it would be better for her if you stepped back and let her explore those feelings. My jaw dropped, my mind scrambling to process what I was hearing. Are you serious? You're asking me to call off my engagement because Erin has feelings? This isn't a crush on some guy she met at work. This is my fiancé. We've been together for 5 years, and now you're suggesting that I just hand him over to her? Mom didn't flinch. We just think it would be best for the family if there weren't any complications. Erin's been having a hard time with this, and we're worried about how it's affecting her. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. All my life I'd played second fiddle to Erin and watched her take the spotlight in every way. But this was the final straw. I turned to Dad, hoping he'd step in and say something reasonable, but he just looked away, avoiding my gaze. It was like I didn't even exist in that room, like my happiness was just a minor inconvenience. So, what you're saying, I said, my voice shaking with anger, is that you'd rather I give up my future, my happiness, just to keep Erin happy. Is that it? Because God forbid she has to learn to respect someone else's relationship? Mom's eyes narrowed. Carly, don't be so dramatic. We're just asking you to think about what's best for everyone involved. And you think this is what's best for me? I asked, barely able to keep my voice steady. Telling your daughter to give up her fiancé just because her sister can't take no for an answer? Erin must have heard the commotion because she appeared in the doorway, looking as if she'd just woken up. She took one look at the three of us, her expression turning into that trademark pout she always used when she wanted sympathy. What's going on? She asked, her eyes darting between us. When she saw me glaring at her, her face softened, like she was trying to look innocent. Carly, I didn't mean to make things hard for you, but I really do have feelings for Luke. I let out a bitter laugh, unable to believe the nerve. Oh, I know, Erin. I've seen the messages. Luke told me all about how you think he should leave me for you and how you're better for him than I am. So, congratulations on your feelings, but it's time to grow up. Erin's face twisted, and she looked at Mom, then back at me, her eyes filling with tears. I can't help how I feel, Carly. It's not fair for you to expect me to just turn it off. Fair? I snapped. You think this is about fairness? Erin, I've spent my entire life watching you get everything handed to you, watching you take whatever you want without thinking about anyone else. Well, this is my life, and I'm not letting you ruin it just because you think you deserve everything I have. Erin's tears started to flow, and she looked to Mom and Dad for support, which of course they gave without hesitation. Mom put an arm around her, soothing her like she was some fragile victim. Meanwhile, I stood there, my fists clenched, my heart pounding, watching them console the person who was trying to sabotage my happiness. Then, Mom turned to me, her expression hardening. If you can't do this one thing for your sister, Carly, then maybe you're the one who's being selfish. You know how much she's been through, and now, of all times, she needs our support. I could feel the anger boiling over. I'd been called selfish my whole life, blamed for things that weren't my fault, told to be the good sister, to make way for Erin. But this time they were asking too much. Way too much. You know what? I said, my voice cold. If that's how you feel, then maybe you shouldn't come to the wedding at all, because I'm not going to let you or Aaron ruin it. Luke and I are getting married, with or without you." Mom's face went pale, and I saw her open her mouth to argue, but I didn't wait to hear it. I turned and walked out, feeling the weight of every suppressed emotion, every unspoken word I'd held back all these years. I could hear Aaron's sobs as I slammed the door, but for the first time, I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel like I owed them anything. When I got back to my car, I sat there for a moment, my hands shaking. I knew I'd just done something that would change things forever, and that I might lose my family over this. But I also knew I couldn't go on like this, constantly sacrificing my happiness just to keep the peace. When I got home, Luke was waiting for me. He took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug, not saying a word, just letting me feel safe. After a few minutes, I told him everything. Every word, every accusation, every moment of doubt that had hung in the air like a storm cloud. He listened, his face growing more serious with every detail, and when I was done, he didn't hesitate. "We don't need them, Carly," he said softly. "If they can't see how much this is hurting you, then they don't deserve to be at our wedding. This is about us, about our future, and we're going to build that future together." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief mixed with sadness. It hurt to know that my family might not be there for one of the biggest days of my life. But in that moment, I realized something. My family wasn't just Mom, Dad, and Aaron. My family was Luke, the friends who supported us, the people who genuinely cared. A few days later, I sent my parents an invitation. A small part of me hoped they'd come to their senses, apologize, and maybe even support me for once. But I knew better than to expect too much. I was done waiting for them to be the family I'd always wanted. After sending that invitation, I tried to focus on the wedding and not think about what my family would do. I knew my parents. They'd either come around or they wouldn't, and there wasn't much I could do to change it. But part of me still clung to a shred of hope. I thought maybe they'd realize how unreasonable they were being, and maybe see that my happiness mattered too. Yet deep down, I knew I couldn't let them keep disappointing me. As the days passed, I buried myself in wedding planning. Luke and I threw ourselves into every detail, from picking the flowers to deciding on the music. And it felt incredible to plan a day that was just about us. My friends and Luke's family were amazing, stepping in to help, offering support, and even giving me that parental warmth I'd always longed for. His mom took me dress shopping, his dad made jokes to lighten the mood, and they made me feel like part of their family. Their warmth was overwhelming in the best way possible, a stark contrast to the coldness I'd been raised in. But of course, nothing can stay perfect for long. Despite Luke blocking Aaron on every platform, she found ways to get messages to him through fake accounts, relentless in her efforts to get his attention. He'd show me every one, and we'd laugh about how ridiculous it was, but deep down I felt a simmering anger. It wasn't funny, it was an invasion, an intrusion into the life I was trying to build. Luke reassured me that he had zero interest in her, but it was exhausting to deal with, a constant reminder of the family drama waiting in the background. One evening, after another long day of planning, my best friend Chloe called me, voice full of urgency. "Carly, I just got off the phone with your mom," she started, clearly bracing herself for my reaction. I felt my stomach twist. "What did she say?" "She tried to convince me to talk you into calling off the wedding," Chloe said, voice tinged with disbelief. "She said it was for the best, and that if you really loved your family, you'd consider Aaron's feelings first." I closed my eyes, the frustration building to a breaking point. Chloe kept talking, telling me how she'd tried to reason with my mom and tried to explain that this was my life, my future. But predictably, it hadn't gotten through. My mom had hung up when it was clear Chloe wasn't on her side. I thanked Chloe for trying, but I could barely focus on her words. My mind was swimming with anger, confusion, and a sad kind of acceptance. They were willing to ruin my wedding just to keep Aaron happy. It was mind-boggling, but it was the truth. The next day, I told Luke what Chloe had said, and we talked about what it meant for us. "Maybe it's time to just let them go," he suggested softly, pulling me close. "We can't keep fighting this battle. You deserve peace, Carly." I knew he was right, but it didn't make it easier. It was like a piece of me was being torn away, forced to cut ties with the people who were supposed to be my biggest supporters. I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief as I decided not to reach out to my family anymore. I would leave the door open, but I couldn't keep hoping they'd change. Luke and I needed to focus on each other, on building our life together, free from all the toxicity. But as our wedding day approached, I couldn't ignore the pang of sadness every time I thought about it. I hadn't heard a word from my family, and it felt like a quiet confirmation of where I stood with them. My friends and Luke's family did their best to keep my spirits up, but there were moments I'd catch myself wondering if I was making a mistake or if there was something more I could do. I knew, though, that I'd done everything I could, and maybe it was time to accept that I'd never get the family support I'd always craved. The night before the wedding, I was at the venue, walking through a final rehearsal, trying to keep my mind on the joy of the day ahead. I kept reminding myself that tomorrow was about me and Luke, that it was about our future together. My friends threw me a little pre-wedding celebration, full of laughter, toasts, and a few tearful moments as we all acknowledged the weight of everything I'd been through to get to this point. They were my family now, and I finally started to feel a glimmer of peace, a sense that things would be okay, even if my family never changed. And then, as if the universe wanted one last test, my mom called. It was late, and I'd almost ignored it, but something made me pick it up. I braced myself, not sure what to expect. She started, her voice uncharacteristically soft. I wanted to let you know that we won't be coming tomorrow. I felt a mix of anger and relief, but I forced myself to stay calm. I figured as much, I replied, my voice steady. I'm sorry you feel that way, Dot. She sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to carry years of misunderstandings and missed moments. It's just, your sister's in a bad place. I thought you'd understand that we have to be there for her. She's our family too, Dot. The words hit me like a slap, the implication clear. They were willing to lose me just to keep her happy. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, but I refused to let my voice waver. I am your family too, Mom, I said quietly. But I guess that doesn't matter. I just hope one day you realize what you're missing. And with that, I hung up, feeling a strange sense of closure. It hurt, yes, but it was freeing too. I'd spent so much of my life chasing their approval, hoping to be seen, to matter. And in that moment, I realized I didn't need it anymore. I had people who loved me, who wanted to celebrate my happiness, and tomorrow I'd be surrounded by them. I told Luke what had happened, and he held me, letting me cry for a few minutes. But then he reminded me of all the people who'd be there and all the love we'd have around us. He helped me remember that my family wasn't defined by blood, but by choice, by the people who stood by me through everything. And he was right. Tomorrow was about us, and I wouldn't let my family's absence steal the joy from that. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I felt a strange peace settle over me. I'd done everything I could, given them every chance. And while it hurt, I knew I had chosen the life that would make me happy, the life that would bring me peace. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and calm, with that gentle morning sun casting everything in a warm, soft light. I woke up with a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. All the stress, the hurt, and the countless conversations with my family weighed on me, yes, but there was also a new clarity. Today was the day I'd start my life with Luke, and I knew, with every part of me, that this was where I was meant to be. My friends and Luke's family helped me get ready, their excitement infectious as they pulled me into the whirlwind of last-minute details. My best friend Chloe handed me the bouquet with a big grin, and Luke's mom slipped me a pair of simple, elegant earrings as something borrowed. Their warmth surrounded me, and I let myself sink into it, grateful to have people in my life who genuinely cared. When it was finally time, I walked out onto the aisle, a beautiful path lined with flowers and framed by the stunning autumn landscape. As I looked ahead, there was Luke, standing at the end, smiling like he'd just won the world. My heart felt light and full, and with each step I felt every doubt, every hurtful moment with my family fall away. This was my life now, my choice, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. The ceremony was everything I'd hoped it would be, simple, heartfelt, and filled with laughter. Our vows felt like a quiet promise, spoken just for us. And as Luke and I held hands, I realized that this was my true family. The people who showed up, who cared, who wanted the best for me. I felt surrounded by love, by people who celebrated who we were together. My heart ached a little, knowing my parents and Aaron had chosen not to be there, but I knew I couldn't let their absence define this moment. After the ceremony, we gathered with everyone for the reception. Luke's dad gave a heartfelt toast, sharing how proud he was to have me as part of their family. His words brought tears to my eyes, and as I looked around the room, I felt such a strong, undeniable sense of belonging. I didn't need validation from my family to feel valued. I had found people who loved me as I was, and that was enough. Later that evening, I caught myself glancing at the empty seats where my parents would have sat, feeling that familiar pang. I knew I might always feel a little hollow when I thought of them. The wish that things could be different, that they'd want to be part of my life without conditions. But then I looked back at Luke and saw him laughing with friends, his gaze finding mine across the room, filled with warmth and assurance. In that moment, any lingering sadness vanished. I had chosen love, and I was surrounded by people who shared that love. My heart felt full. The reception was everything we could have wanted, filled with laughter, dancing, and joy. At one point, Luke's mom pulled me into a tight hug, whispering, "You're part of our family now, Carly, always." And for the first time, I believed it. I felt the quiet strength of knowing I wasn't alone, that I was finally accepted, finally loved for who I was. As the night wound down, Luke and I shared a quiet moment together, sitting on a small bench outside, watching the stars. He wrapped an arm around me, pulling me close, and I rested my head on his shoulder, taking a deep breath. The air was cool, the world silent, and for the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. I quote, "Am so glad I found you," I whispered, my voice soft, filled with gratitude for the man beside me. He kissed my forehead, his hand warm on mine. "And I'm glad you're mine, Carly. This is our life now, and it's going to be beautiful." As we sat there, I knew that my journey with my family wasn't over, but I'd finally learned to set boundaries, to hold on to my peace, and to build a life where I came first. I couldn't change them. I couldn't make them see what they were missing, but I could make sure that I never let anyone diminish me again. Luke and I left for our honeymoon the next day, and every moment since then has felt like a dream, filled with laughter, kindness, and the quiet, unspoken promises we make to each other every day. I've chosen to focus on the people who love me, the people who stand by me, and to finally release the hold my family's absence had on my heart. Reflecting back, I realize that family isn't defined by blood, but by the people who choose to stand beside you, who celebrate your joy, who lift you up even when times are hard. I have that now in Luke, in his family, in our friends, and that's enough. So here I am, a married woman, deeply grateful for the people who stayed, the love I've found, and the life Luke and I are building together. I can't control my family, but I can control the life I create, and I choose to fill it with love, with joy, and with the kind of peace that only comes from letting go of what you can't change. Thank you all for being here and for sharing your wisdom, your support, and your kindness through this journey. I'm moving forward now, with a heart full of hope and a life I finally claimed as my own story, too. Once I become 18, I will never talk to my dad or stepmom again. Growing up, I felt my family was really normal. Although they were not very loving or anything, my parents appeared sturdy. My dad was the usual provider. He liked to call himself. My mom looked after the house. Life was just sufficient. Nothing too ostentatious. We got by, and I didn't give much thought to my dad's unusual work schedule since my mom was home all the time. He would go early and return late. But hey, I just realized that's how adults worked. Children seldom challenge ideas like that. When I turned 7, everything turned around. That year, my dad's secret came out, and I still get the sensation of being hit by a bus. One day, I returned home from school and could almost sense the tension in the house hovering in the air. My mother was hardly at all like herself. She seemed to be simply going through the motions, pallid and nearly frozen. She dismissed me when I inquired whether everything was well, instructing me to get to my room. Though at the time I had no idea, this was the beginning of my life disintegrating. As it happens, my dad had been cheating on my mother. This was not mere flirting or anything. Years of seeing this other woman had gone by. Still worse, they had a child together, a child I would someday have to live with. Let me not, however, leap too far ahead. As soon as she knew, my mother sought to flee with me. She wanted nothing with my dad or his problems. She started gathering anything we could put into bags. I recall seeing her toss odd objects and clothing into bags. Her hands trembles the entire while. I didn't quite understand what was happening at that moment, but seeing her so terrified me. My dad walks there, and he wasn't alone. Just as she is virtually pulling me out the door, he carried with him another woman, the mistress here. She wore a haughty attitude as though she had won some award or something. He wasn't having it when my mother urged him to get lost and let us go. He once told her actual calm like that. Should she try to grab me, he would see to ensure her deportation. Here might be the place I should clarify anything. Mother is an immigrant. Her visa condition was, well, let's say it was messy. By now she had overstayed years. Not officially in the States, they were merely married through the church. Before my dad tossed it in her face, I knew none of it. He assured her he would phone immigration personally should she try to depart with me. Even for him, that was a low blow. My mother had no option. She couldn't gamble getting deported and leaving him behind. Like me about to be, she was imprisoned. I will always remember her stare at me when she at last acknowledged she was caught. Her heart seemed to break right then. She attempted to reassure me everything would be well, but I could see from her eyes otherwise. She disagreed with it. I suppose I did neither, but what could I have done? Just a small child stuck in the center of this catastrophe they created. My dad then brought me to live with his mistress. It seemed as though I had been thrown into some warped variation of my former existence. I suddenly no longer lived in my own house, and everything around felt weird and incorrect. Mistress. To simplify matters, I'll just name her M. Day 1 made it really evident that I was not present to participate in their family life. Not exactly. I was only a handy additional pair of hands, a friend for her and her son. Her son is... Although I knew my half-brother required special attention, he had Down syndrome. It was very clear they wanted me to be the one doing most of it. The first few days passed in a haze of directives. Aid him with this, watch him eating, prevent him from straying. After school, I would be supposed to take over his care when they got home. Well, who knows what? 2 was me, a little child, but I was meant to be some sort of caretaker or babysitter suddenly. Anytime I mentioned my personal needs, like wanting time for myself or to play with friends, you could see I would have the same lecture. Family takes first. You have to pick up more. Currently, you are the big sister. Behave as though it were so. Though I was barely older than him and really had no idea how to manage all this, they essentially expected me to treat him like he was my duty. The worst aspect was my dad's approach. Originally meant to be my guardian and father, this man just became a stranger, viewing me as nothing more than a tool. Saying it was good for me to help out, he would see me struggle and dismiss it. Everything I had in my former life, including my toys, minor interests, was left behind. If I ever brought up my mother, he would get this expression and advise me to concentrate on the family here. He seemed to want to completely wipe her off of my mind. Make it such I had no link to her or my former life. Though it felt impossible, I attempted to retain some normalcy. There is work to be done here, hence even things like school projects or desire to play sports got cancelled. It was stifling and nobody around appeared to give a damn. Seeing other children at school with their parents, I could only feel this strange mix of envy and resentment. How did I get with a dad who considered me as nothing more than an unpaid worker? Why did I have to lose my mother only because he messed a M? She let me live with them, acting as though she was doing me some kind favor. She would go on about how fortunate I was to have a roof over my head, as though her generosity defined my entire life. It made no difference that my dad drove this entire disaster upon us. She treated me as some unwelcome visitor in my own father's house. One evening I listened in the kitchen while they spoke. M was grumbling about me, claiming I needed to pull my weight and wasn't very helpful. Like you hardly remembered, my dad simply nodded along, matching her agreement. I was his child as well. Hearing them talk about me like way, as though I were only some burden, hit me more than I would have imagined. Deep down, I knew that maybe, no matter what, my dad would view me as his daughter first. But that evening, I came to see I was but another duty to him. Looking back, I most likely started resenting him at that point. He was not just my dad, prone to error. This person stole my life, tore it apart, and showed no regard whatsoever for the bits he left behind. And I was imprisoned there, unable of influencing any of it, just hoping for an unrealized type of miracle. Em was all about ensuring her son took front stage, and my dad agreed wholeheartedly. Though I felt more like hired assistants than a daughter, I was supposed to be thankful to live with them. Every day ran the same schedule. I woke up, helped my brother, then headed to school. The second I returned home to resume household responsibilities. And by family responsibilities, I mean I was supposed to assist him in everything, feeding him, playing with him, even handling his outbursts should he become frustrated, like I ought to be his emotional punching bag as well. The worst was that nothing I did ever felt sufficient for him. She would linger over my shoulder, berating every tiny detail. She would object if I fed him too slowly, saying he would become agitated if I didn't react to him quickly enough. She would snap at me to focus. Some days I wanted to scream, as she would find something wrong no matter how hard I tried, and let me say straightforwardly, there was no trouble for this woman expressing precisely her feelings. You have to start being more responsible, she would say, as though I were asking for any of this. Then there was my dad, really like a ghost living in the house. He would be around, but he would check out if things became difficult. Should Em and I be handling a tantrum from my brother, he would just exit the room as though it were someone else's concern. Though I'm not clear what I anticipated from him, it most certainly wasn't this. He seemed to have decided that his new family came first and I was merely there. One more. I couldn't recall the last time someone inquired about my homework or how my day went. I needed support. That just wasn't given top importance. Even things like getting me clothes or school supplies felt like a weight to them. They would discuss how costly it was to look after my brother and how everyone in the family had to give up something for his benefit. She meant me personally by everyone. Usually, her sacrifices consist in her sitting on the couch while I rushed about doing everything she did not feel like. I began numbing to it finally. Each day seemed to be survival mode. I would go through the motions, attempting to make it to the end of the day without running across criticism. Should I remain under observation, I would lower my head, remain silent, and pray they would leave me alone. Though most of the time they found something to blame me for, occasionally it worked. Still, one day things reach a whole new low. Was in one of her moods and grumbled about how I wasn't helping enough, and that I should be more involved in looking after her brother. Remember wondering, are you really serious? I was only young as well. Though I had not registered for this life, I was attempting to defend or stand up for myself. Complete time wasted. Should I dare say anything, I would be instantly dismissed. If she believed it would make me more compliant, this woman had no trouble making me feel like dirt. She would suggest things like, perhaps you should go live somewhere else if you can't manage this. Full well, I had nowhere else to go. She hung that over me, telling me all the time that they were providing a home. As usual, my dad would sit there silently, allowing her to run the show. I'm not sure if he just didn't care, or whether he agreed she was correct. He never once had my back, but anyway. Then there was school, which turned out to be my one remaining haven. Still, they started expecting me to bring him to his appointments or assist with his special programs, so even that became twisted up. These obligations gradually bit away any additional time I had. I would experience a gnawing jealously when other children in my class hung around doing activities or sports. My life ran somewhat differently from theirs. Anytime I tried to tell her I was struggling and would roll her eyes saying I was overdramatic, she would go on about how hard it was to take care of my brother, how we all had to pull together to make it work. I would come home tired just to get thrust back into caretaker mode. Honestly, though, there was no we, only I was doing. Acting as the martyr for preserving this family, she sat back while I worked on the messy chores. One evening, as everything simply boiled over, I will never forget. My school day had been really difficult. I was simply done. The night before, I slept poorly. Along with having a bad day, my brother was acting differently than normal. I was running on fumes by supper time. She snapped at me, telling me I was useless if I cannot do this easy work. Therefore, I must have been moving too slowly for my liking. That was all. It was intolerable now. If it's so easy, why not you do it for a second? I asked her straight in the eyes. I had assumed I would lose. She just stood there silent, then her face contorted in fury, and she virtually yelled at me, stating if I wanted to live away from them, I should do so. Like nothing was happening, my dad was seated there finishing his meal, hoping he would intervene. I gazed at him. Perhaps speak to someone to defend me. He sighed like I was some inconvenience he had to deal with. In that instant, it struck me. He never was going to support me. Not against her, though. Not for anything specifically. In that house, I was utterly alone. I then just quit trying to resist. Not worth the tension, was it? To be honest, I had none in me anymore. I would follow their directions, go through the motions, and try not to draw notice. That numbing I had been experiencing. It was sliding towards something darker. Emotion, fury, bitterness, even hate maybe. Knowing that any indication of resistance would just make things worse, I kept it all bottled up though. I began to consider maybe this was simply my life right now. Imprisoned in a house unfit for me, trapped in a position I never desired with no escape. Every day unfolded the same pattern. Learning. Come back home and finish housework. Looking after my sibling is important. Get shouted at. Go to bed and repeat all the following day. Deep down though, there remained a shard of hope clinging to me. Neither when nor how I should have known. I was resolved one day I would leave there. The only thing keeping me going was that. Especially on the worst of days. I had picked a few survival techniques by the time I entered my teens. One of the main ones was being underactive. They would mainly leave me alone if I stayed silent and followed whatever EM advised to do. But primarily, it was insufficient. They attempted to lure me into assisting with my brother's appointments, his treatment, and everything else that took up my time. The older I became, the more they wanted. I suppose that at this time I hardly had an existence apart from them, just what they wanted. Still, I had a bit of a rebellious bent and wasn't ready to let them rule. All about the time I became 15. After school, I found a part-time work at a neighborhood business. Since they knew it meant more money for the family, my dad and mom were all too eager to let me work. But what they were unaware of was that my route out was this employment. It granted me liberties. More crucially though, a little cash I could stow away. One day I would probably need it. I told them my shifts were longer than they really were, which gave me some more time. And at that period, what was my activity? I began to slip off to see my mother. After years of practically no communication, she had at last found her apartment not too far from here. Though to me it seemed like paradise. She was renting a small apartment with only the necessities. Just sitting down to chat to her seemed like rediscovering a part of me I had lost. She still was getting back on her feet, working any employment she might obtain. Though I could tell she had trouble, she would up a strong front whenever I visited. The visits escaped my dad's and mother's knowledge. Naturalistically. Should they have, they would have ended them quickly. Usually I just let them know I was staying late at work. This seemed to work as they appreciated me learning responsibility. I would finish up at my work and then head to my mother's. We would just chat while seated on her lumpy couch eating whatever she had in the refrigerator. She occasionally would share with me tales from her early years about her life before to all this turmoil. Among the few times I felt like a true child once more were the ones. Seeing my mother enjoy that, striving yet free, reminded me of what I wanted for myself. She urged me constantly to keep my brain clear and hang in there. She would remark, "One day we will leave this behind." And even though I doubted it completely, hearing her say that kept me going. Those visits kept me sane, but in my world, nice things seldom last very long. I suppose I was overly direct. Alternatively, perhaps one day someone spotted us together. The door went unopened by my mother. I called out her, knocked, but there was no response. My gut sank. Though something indicated it was awful, I did not want to presume the worst. Finding out took not too long. Later that evening heard me on the phone attempting to contact my mother. She wanted to know what I was hiding and questioned why I would have been behaving covertly. Though I attempted to dismiss her, she persisted. I crumbled at last and informed her I had been seeing my mother. She stared startled, then became enraged. I knew I had screwed up as well. My dad sat down with me the next day, not even screaming, which would have made things worse somehow. He seemed deflated, like I had betrayed him or something. I never will forget what he said. "If you keep doing this, you will only make her life more difficult." He said nothing more than that. Not an apology, not a pity, just a kind reminder. My behavior was somehow making things worse for my mother. Given that he had placed her in that position initially, I thought he was blaming me for her circumstances, which was ludicrous. 1 week later, I found out. My mother had been sent for deportation. She was gone exactly like that. Returned to a location she hadn't resided in years. I felt crushed. The only legitimate family I had left was hers. She was now beyond grasp as well. Not even fazed by it were my parents. Mom merely shrugged and remarked, "At least now you won't have to skulk around any longer." They behaved as like she were some stranger, as though she hadn't been in my life. It was frustrating. That day started something in me. That was the point at which I truly stopped worrying about what my dad or Em thought of me. They had removed the one person who really looked out for me. For what, too? To preserve their modest family image. It let me realize how disorganized they were, and that should I ever be free, I would have to live by my own guidelines without my mother around. Uncertain of what to do. I spent days lost, only running through the motions. Then something clicked though. I couldn't allow them to triumph. For me, they already had stolen so much, and I was not ready to let them imprison me indefinitely. I began returning to work, working extra shifts, saving yet more. Though I had no explicit strategy, I knew I would be ready when the time arrived. I attempted to be invisible once my mom was deported. I lowered my head, followed expectations, and steered clear of anything that would draw my dad's notice. Every day felt like I was walking on eggshells, and any incorrect action may set off one of them's moods, which could entail hours of nasty remarks and more work thrown upon me. Under all that I was organizing, though, if I wanted out, I realized I had to play my cards exactly. Suddenly then, my mother's friend showed up. Let me refer to her as Lisa. She was among the few people who hadn't cut off my mother following all of this. Lisa behaved as a true friend, the sort who stayed around even amid trying circumstances. She came to me after somehow learning about my circumstances. One day I received an SMS from an unidentified number. Said, "Hello, this is Lisa, your mother's buddy. I'm willing to assist." Not sure whether it was really genuine, I peered at it. It felt too sweet to be true, following all I had gone through. Still, it was true. And Lisa proved to be my lifeline as well. Where I could get away, we met in secret. She would choose a peaceful area free from recognition by anybody, typically some little bistro or vacant park. We could discuss anything. How had my mother been behaving following deportation? Her attempts to put her life back together, and the extent she missed me, finding out my mother was at least living, gave me some hope. In a long time, I hadn't felt. Lisa had little money, but she would divide it anyhow she could spare. I should hide it, she said, and really trust me, I did. In my room where I knew and would never visit, I had scattered the money haphazardly. She was too preoccupied ensuring I followed rules to see. Though little, the money accumulated over time. Though I had no explicit strategy, knowing I had some backup changed everything. I had some degree of control over my life for the first time. Lisa handed me something far more important than money one day, a low-cost ancient phone. It was only an antiquated model she had discovered, nothing special. Still, it worked. She informed me my mother had obtained a phone number and I could call her should I so want. My hands shook when I initially phoned the number. I was scared I might forget what my mom sounded like. I hadn't heard her in so long. I hardly could get any words out when she picked up. She was weeping, and I was standing there trying to keep myself together. On that initial call, we spoke little. Yet, it was sufficient to know she was there. We spoke anytime I could slip away. Hearing her voice, even on a cheap phone, felt like getting a bit of my former life back. Lisa gave me more than just a phone and some money. She provided me guidance as well. She would advise me to keep up the charade until I was old enough to go permanently and not allow my dad or create any cracks. She would advise not telling them they're getting to you. Though it wasn't easy living with those two, I wouldn't take her counsel. Every time I felt comfortable, they seemed to find a way to screw things back up once again. Mom discovered a little cache of money I had buried beneath my bed one evening. She turned, accusing me of family theft. She refused to hear me try to explain that I had saved money for my job. She drew my dad into it, and they both sat me down, behaving as though I had committed some horrible treachery. My dad looked at me disappointedly, and I started raving about unappreciative children and how blessed I was to have a roof over my head. I spoke no words at all. Though in my brain I was furious, I let them continue behaving like I was sorry. Right then, I realized I would have to be much more vigilant going forward. I then became wiser. I began to hide money in locations I knew just outside the home. Occasionally, I would give it to Lisa to hang on to for me in case. She constantly advised me to save enough money to get by should things turn sour. Her encouragement was like this unseen safety net I could rely on. Even if everything else seemed wobbly, I was almost living two lives at home by the time I was 17. I was this quiet, compliant child who never started problems. But outdoors, whether I got time with Lisa or spoke with my mother, I felt like myself. I had no need for acting. Without thinking someone would leap down my neck, I could laugh, weep, complain about him, or discuss the future. My motivation came from that tiny taste of freedom. Lisa started chatting to me about what I wanted to do next because she knew I was almost 18. Mom and Dad anticipated me to stay around, maybe permanently, to assist with my brother. They thought I would just remain as a regular component of their dysfunctional system. Lisa pointed out, though, that I had choices even if they weren't ideal. Lisa sat down one day and said, "Have you considered college or anything else you might want to do after turning 18? She was deliberate, not merely chatting. I hadn't thought about college much since it seemed unattainable with little support from my parents and scarcely any money. I figured it was a fantasy out of grasp, but she didn't let it go. She urged me to seek for scholarships, stating I deserved a genuine opportunity. Lisa had started chatting to my mother about securing a scholarship for me, although at the time I had no idea. She didn't tell me immediately away, possibly because she didn't want to get my hopes up. Knowing she was in my corner like that, though, meant more than I could have possibly spoken. I spent that last year simply scraping by, clinging onto the money I'd saved, and keeping my goals a secret. The days melted together, with survival my primary concentration, until I reached that wonderful age when I could leave without their permission. Every time Em would nag, or my dad would ignore me, I would simply tell myself, just a bit longer. It was my motto, the thing that prevented me from cracking. I was ready as my 18th birthday started to approach. The money I'd saved wasn't much, but it was plenty. Enough to go away, enough to start over, enough to finally take charge of my own life. Lisa and my mom had given me everything they could, and now it was up to me. The countdown was on, and every day that passed, I got one step closer to freedom. I could nearly taste it. When I turned 18, I knew my life was going to change. I've been waiting for this day for so long, planning, saving, counting down every single day, until I could finally leave my dad's house without having to ask anyone's permission. I slept hardly the evening before. I constantly reviewing my strategy to make sure I had everything I would need. Never had I felt this anxious, everything I had been concealing for so long. But concurrently, I experienced this unusual tranquility. I knew that at the end of the day, I'd be free. My dad and Em didn't suspect anything. They assumed I'd be around forever, always eager to help with my brother and tackle whatever they threw at me. I hadn't told them about any of my ideas. Why would I? All they'd done over the years was neglect or degrade me, making me feel like I owed them my time, my energy, my whole existence. Still, they did not possess me. And today, I was at last going to demonstrate it. I loaded everything I had been storing early that morning. Lisa had handed me a little duffel bag filled with clothing, money, and anything valuable I could have managed. I gazed around my room for the final time, this space that had seemed more like a prison cell than a bedroom. I didn't feel sad or nostalgic. All I felt was relief, like I was finally peeling off a thick coat that had been weighing me down for years. My dad was at work and Em was distracted with my brother as usual. It was a wonderful arrangement. I didn't want any drama, no big goodbye, just a quiet leaving that would leave everyone wondering. I put notes on the kitchen counter, brief and straightforward. It just said I'm heading out. I'm not returning. Straightforwardly. They didn't deserve anything more. I went out the door, and for the first time I felt light. No one was watching me. No one was instructing me what to do. No one was dragging me back. I didn't have to peek over my shoulder or fret about getting home on time. At last under control, it seemed like the nicest thing on earth. Not turning around, I strolled along the street carrying my duffel bag. Once, Lisa was waiting for me a few blocks away, exactly like we'd arranged. She had her car parked by the side of the road, and the second I got in, she flashed me this tremendous grin. "You did it," she said, and honestly, hearing those words made everything strike me at once. I'd truly done it. I was out. I couldn't hold back anymore. I just began to chuckle, a genuine chuckle, the sort I hadn't had in years. We traveled for a little while, catching up and chatting. Lisa resembled in my life a safe, encouraging presence, the only one who had seen everything. She asked not whether I was good, didn't try to dig for specifics. She just let me enjoy the moment. Finally free from all the burden, it felt fantastic, like I was shedding a weight I didn't even realize I'd been carrying for so long. Not even the finest thing, though, was that. Lisa eventually removed an envelope from her bag and gave it to me. She stated, "From your mother here." My heart stopped just about here. Though we spoke a few times, I hadn't dared to think my mom would be engaged in my escape since she was deported. She hadn't seen me in person. But here was this mail bearing my name in her known handwriting. Within there was an airline ticket. A airline ticket to my mother's nation. Speechless, I just gazed at it as my thoughts struggled to catch up. Totally shocked, I turned to face Lisa. She nodded and grinned as though she were reading my mind. "Your mother has long been working on this. She came onto a scholarship for you at a nearby institution. All set up as this. You see her?" I found it unbelievable. It was almost like a dream, and I almost expected to awaken in that terrible room at my dad's house. Nonetheless, this was actual. My mother had done something rather amazing, not even anything I would have considered feasible. She had figured out a means of starting me over, far from all that had depressed me for years. I had her scheduled to visit, spend time with her, seize an opportunity for a regular existence. I spent that whole journey in a fog after Lisa took me to the airport, double-checking the date, the time like it would vanish if I stopped staring at the ticket. Though it was mine, the whole affair felt unreal, as though I was observing someone else's narrative. At the airport, at last, something decent was happening to me. Lisa gave me a really firm embrace. "Look out for yourself," she said. I assured myself I would. I would never be able to pay her back for everything she had done. She had been there for me like nobody else. Knowing I owed her so much, she waved as I passed through security. I waved back. Though this marked the start of something greater, I would miss her. The journey was lengthy, and I slept little at all. Like I had to hang on to each memory to make sure it was genuine. I continued playing everything in my head. I imagined what it would be like to at last see her again, seeing her mother's face, to occupy a room with her free from guilt or shame or the weight of my dad's control. Though it was difficult, I tried not to get overly sentimental. I had something to be excited about once, a future not predicated on someone else's maps. When the aircraft touched down, my heart thumping in response. After customs, I picked up my suitcase and headed into the arriving section, and she was standing there waiting for me. Her mother. She seemed older than I had recalled and more worn out. But she was present. She stared with tears in her eyes, a smile starting to crack through. She held me tighter than I had ever been hugged in my life as I hurried to her. We said very little, simply kept close to one another. That moment seemed to dissolve all I had gone through. At last, I was home. Though I had no idea what the future contained, I felt I could manage anything that came up with her by my side. The years spent caught in a pattern, the loneliness, the wrath, all of that began to dissipate. I was with my mom and free, and for the first time I felt as though I fit someplace. She told me more about the college, the scholarship, the life she had been striving toward for us as we drove to her house. I listened, a mixture of comfort and exhilaration. My starting point now was this, a chance to be someone different than the child looking after everyone else. At last, I would be myself, free from anyone dictating my existence. Reflecting back, none of it makes me regretful. Not the waiting either, not the concealing, not even the arguments with my dad or Em. It gave me greater will to discover my own road and strengthened me. Now, with my mother by my side, I felt I would at last be living the life I had been dreaming about for years. Finally, update. You people would not believe what just transpired. Let me dissect it for you here. A few months after I had at last moved in with my mother, I received some word from back home. It seemed like an odd, twisted epilogue to the dream I had left behind. Though I didn't hear from anyone back there, one day Mrs. Perez, our former neighbor, sent me a note. She had been one of the few kind individuals I had around back when I was living with my dad and Em. She would occasionally slip me food when I was left to fend for myself, or give me little items I needed. I totally forgot about her in the turmoil of leaving. Always with that kind grin that says, "Hang in there." She tried to help, but she never had much. Not least of all, seeing her note surprised me. She had heard via the grapevine that I had left and wanted to check in, see how I was doing. I hadn't considered she would reach out. I told her I was at last free and had moved in with my mother. She delightedly felt this. She even texted a small love emoji, which was rather romantic coming from her. Her telling me what was happening back at my dad's place, though, truly caught me off guard. As it happens, things had gone rapidly south once I departed. My mother and dad were in the throes of a horrible divorce. Reading that paragraph almost caused me to drop my phone. Divorce. Together, they had always appeared like some unshakable, unhappy team. I had always imagined they would spend their whole lives torturing everyone around them and each other. But evidently, the fissures had begun to emerge almost as soon as I was absent from the scene. Mrs. Perez said it seemed as though Mom had captured when I went. She had been growing more demanding, berating my dad over everything, particularly on the care of my half-brother. I suppose all the weight I used to bear was thrown directly on them, and none of them could manage it. Without me there to keep it sewn together, the entire arrangement came apart. When I consider it, it's darkly funny how they would have dumped everything on me for years, treating me as useless. And they were disintegrating since I was gone. That was not even the craziest part. Mrs. Perez nuke landed on me. My sibling was not even the offspring of Dad. I was first only in astonishment. I had years of looking after the child. Given he claimed to be my half-brother, we were family, and along it had been a lie. Mrs. Perez clarified that there had been some type of medical problem, something major that called for understanding family history. And thus everything started to fall apart. Thinking DNA testing might assist identify the cause, my dad had gone through it and discovered he had no relationship whatsoever to my brother. My dad apparently became rather angry. He thought he had fallen into a scam, like Em had somehow misled him into this lifetime. Not even his was what I meant. To be honest, Mrs. Perez's telling me it seemed like some sort of twisted justice made me nearly giggle. All those years he had been hovering over me, making me feel tiny and using me to help with his children. And he then discovered the child was not even his. There was no greater finale for their small, ideal family farce. Mrs. Perez reported that my dad packed his luggage and fled once the test results came in. He wanted nothing associated with Em or her son anymore. He would have totally abandoned them. Em was in a mess, she informed me, weeping to everyone who would listen about how unfair it all was. I will say straight up that I wanted to go back there only to witness her facial expression. She treated me like garbage during all those years, like I owed her my entire life. She was the one left by herself now, handling all on her own. Learning about my dad's response seemed contradictory. To be honest, I loathed him for a long time. He had treated me like nothing at all, for the benefit of a child he didn't even know was his. Some of me thought he deserved what he was going through, every tiny act of treachery and resentment. But another side of me developed an odd kind of sympathy for him. He had lived his life around a falsehood, around the kid of someone else, and he was now seeing how empty everything was. Mrs. Perez asked if I wanted her to forward a note to him. Though I wanted to, I never spoke with him about what occurred. I failed to see the relevance. Long ago, when he determined I wasn't his top concern, he had made his decision. He should sit with it. deal with the disaster he produced without dragging me back into it. For so long he would subject me through so much. It was almost appropriate for him to go through some of the aftermath on his own. Knowing he would finally be facing some repercussions he was suffering, even a portion of the betrayal I had experienced seemed somehow like closure. I had no need of returning, not needed to see it personally. Just hearing about it was plenty. I was free from his dream while he was living it right now. I appreciated Mrs. Perez bringing this forth. I advised her not to worry about me any longer as I was doing great. She advised me she would be available should I ever need anything and wished me luck. We hadn't spoken in quite some years. Knowing she was still there, though, meant a great deal. She was pulling for me. That brings us to where it all finished. I was far away as my dad received his just compensation and was left to cope with her mess. At last starting the life I want. It was genuine rather than some fairy tale conclusion or anything else. It was justice in its own disorganized manner. I also felt for once free from all of it, all set to begin a life genuinely mine.